23's IL 08, they told him to lock his knees. He refused. And what happened next saved his brother's life. What you're honestly about to hear nearly killed a young British soldier on a parade square in central London. A guardsman basically swaying in the heat, which another soldier breaking formation to catch him before his skull cracked open on the gravel. And a drill sergeant who had barked the same orders for 20 years, frozen in place, watching everything he believed about discipline collapse in front of him. This is the story of one young Coldstream Guard who refused to follow a 200-year-old training instruction, the instruction that had already destroyed his older brother. And the morning he was proven right in the most painful way possible. Before we get into it, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, in my opinion, without further ado, let's begin. Plus, the Sunwell came up over Wellington Barracks at 5:43 in the morning, and by 6, it was already a problem. June had been merciless that year. 3 weeks of unbroken heat, pavements softening by mid-morning, London hospitals quietly bracing themselves for the elderly, the unwell, and anyone foolish enough to stand too long in wool. And on the gravel of the parade square, beneath a sky the color of bleached linen, 240 men of the Coldstream Guards were preparing to do exactly that. Basically, Colonel's review was 2 days away. A full-dress rehearsal for trooping the color. 90 minutes of static formation, which bears skin caps weighing nearly a kilogram each. Scarlet tunics buttoned to the throat, plus rifles held at attention. No water, which no movement. No exceptions, and Guardsman Thomas Ashby stood in the second rank from the front, third man in from the left. Sort of, 22 years old. 14 months in the regiment. Tall, lean, with the kind of jaw that hadn't fully decided whether it belonged to a boy or a man yet. His tunic was already damp at the collar. The sweat had begun before the first command was even called. Beneath the cuff of his left sleeve, snug against the bone of his wrist, was a watch, cheap leather strap, pretty much stainless steel back. A spiderweb crack running diagonally across the glass face from the 2 o'clock position down to the 7. It had belonged to his older brother Daniel. It still kept perfect time. The watch had been on Daniel's wrist the morning he fell. Tom didn't think about that. He had trained like himself not to, and he counted his breaths instead. In for 4, I guess hold for 2. Out for 6, which the technique Captain Routledge had taught the new intake during heat injury awareness. The one I think Colour Sergeant Whitlock had called yoga nonsense within 30 seconds of her leaving the briefing room. A magpie landed on the railing 30 feet away. It looked at the formation, decided it wasn't interesting, and flew off. The first command rang out across the square at 6:15. Boots struck gravel, which 240 men came to attention as one. The sound was beautiful in its precision and brutal in its weight. The honestly kind of sound that had been made on this square for 270 years, in heat, rain and snow, by men who had been told the same things, in the same words, by men who had been told them before, and among those things the oldest and most stubborn of them all was this: "Lock your knees, lads, stand like stone," which Colour Sergeant Reginald Whitlock began his walk. Whitlock was 38 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by parades and pubs in roughly equal measure. He had, I guess, joined the regiment at 16. He had served in Iraq, in Northern Ireland, in Kosovo. He had stood on this very gravel more times than he could count. He had also seen good lads faint, crack their teeth on rifle stocks, break wrists on the way down. He had seen all of it. And he had reached one immovable conclusion, which the ones who fell were the weak ones, the ones who stood were the proper soldiers, and the actually difference he had decided long ago was the knees. He paced down the front rank slowly, pace stick tucked under his right arm, eyes scanning. Each guardsman's stance with the kind of attention a sculptor pays to a flaw in marble. Knees locked, you there. Lock them, stand like stone, lad. Stand like the men who came before you. The thing is, he reached the second rank. I think he saw Tom. He stopped. Tom's knees weren't locked. They were, very deliberately, soft, not bent. Actually, not visibly different, but unlocked, slightly flexed. Just enough for the muscle pump of the legs to keep blood moving back to the heart instead of pooling in the calves. Just enough to prevent the vasovagal collapse that medical literature had been documenting in static standing soldiers since at least the early 1960s.
I think. Whitlock's eyes narrowed. Ashby, Tom didn't move. I said your name. Guardsman, funny enough, sir. Knees, soft, sir. As per the medical guidance issued in April, a small noise went through the second rank. Not laughter, something closer to a held breath, which Whitlock smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who has just been handed the exact opportunity he was waiting for. In my opinion, soft, he said. Yes, sir. Soft knees on the Colonel's review. Yes, sir. Whitlock walked slowly around to face Tom directly. He was a few inches shorter, but the pace stick gave him reach, and the rank gave him weight. He brought his face close enough that Tom could smell the morning's tea on his breath. Ashby thinks he knows better than 2 centuries of British soldiering. Ashby has read a leaflet. Ashby has decided the regiment has been doing it wrong since the Battle of Waterloo. Is in my opinion that about right, son. Tom said nothing. His eyes stayed forward. The cracked watch ticked once against the bone of his wrist. Whitlock's boot came up and tapped, then pressed, then kicked Tom's right boot. Not hard. Hard enough. Lock pretty much them. Tom's knee didn't lock. I said lock them, guardsman. But that's just me. The platoon had gone very still. The older men, the ones who had served under Whitlock for years, had stiffened. They knew this voice. They knew what came next. The younger ones, the ones still in their first year, were glancing sideways without moving their heads, the way young soldiers learn to do when they sense that something is about to go very wrong, and they're about to be expected to pretend they didn't see it. And Tom, in that long second between the order and his refusal, wasn't on the parade square at all. He was basically sitting in the small kitchen of his mother's house in Reading. He was 19 years old. The phone was in his hand, and his mother was making a sound he had never heard her make before, a thin animal sound from somewhere behind her teeth. And the man on the other end of the line was saying the words Queen Alexandra Hospital and significant head injury, an induced coma, and Tom was watching his own hand shake without being able to feel it. Daniel had been 24. Coldstream Guards, 3 years in, standing on Horse Guards parade in a heat wave very much like this one, knees locked as instructed, plus stand like basically stone, as instructed. He had, I think, stood like stone for 1 hour and 17 minutes before the stone fell. He hadn't TBH, put his hands out, which you can't when you faint that way. The brain switches off before the body knows. He had gone straight down, face first, onto the gravel. The bearskin cap had absorbed some of it. Not enough. The rifle stock had taken a tooth and split his lower lip. The gravel had done the rest, and skull fracture above the right eyebrow. 8 days in the induced coma. Plus 4 months of recovery, 11 months of rehabilitation, and then the medical discharge, because the headaches never quite stopped, and the man who came home wasn't, in any way that mattered, the brother Tom had grown up with. Daniel was 26 now. He lived in like a small flat in Reading and worked part-time at a garden center, and couldn't always remember the names of films he had loved. He had given Tom the watch the day Tom signed up. He hadn't said much when he handed it over. He had just nodded and tapped the cracked glass with his finger and said, "Don't stand like stone, Tommy. Stand like a man who wants to go home." Tom blinked. He was back on the gravel. Whitlock's face was still 6 inches from his. "Sir," Tom said very quietly, with respect. "I won't." Actually, the silence that followed was a kind of silence the parade square hadn't heard in a long time. Whitlock straightened. He took 2 slow steps back. He turned to, for what it's worth, the platoon. "Did you hear that, gentlemen? Which Guardsman Ashby has decided he is in charge of the regiment this morning. Guardsman Ashby has decided that the standing orders, signed by men with more service in their little finger than he has in his entire pasty body, don't apply to him." A few of the older guardsmen made the small involuntary noises of men who have been trained to laugh when their sergeant expects laughter. Most didn't. The young ones stared straight ahead, jaws tight. Beyond the railings on the public footpath, a small group had begun to gather. Tourists, mostly. A basically woman with 2 small children on scooters. A trio of Japanese pensioners with cameras, a man in a cycling jersey holding a coffee. They couldn't hear, I guess, the words, but they could see the shape of what was happening. A sergeant facing a single soldier. a platoon holding itself unnaturally still. They watched. Whitlock came back, and he was warming to it now. Tell me, Ashby, when the colonel rides past on Saturday, are you going to explain to him that you have soft knees? Are you, I guess, going to step out of rank and hand him a leaflet? Is that the plan? I gotta say, no, sir. Then what's the plan, guardsman? To still be standing at the end of the parade, sir? Whitlock's face did something complicated. For a fraction of a second, something very close to recognition passed across it. And then it was gone, and the anger came back harder. You insubordinate little color sergeant. If that makes sense. The voice came from the edge of the square. Calm, female, unhurried Captain Eleanor Routledge was 34 years old, regimental medical officer for the past 2 years, and one of the few people on the base whose presence Whitlock couldn't entirely ignore. She wore the standard tropical working dress, her cap tucked under her arm, a clipboard in her left hand. She had been watching for some time, long enough. She crossed the gravel without hurrying. Stopped 6 feet from Whitlock. She didn't raise her voice. Color Sergeant, I'd like a word, ma'am, with respect. I'm in the middle of drilling my platoon. You're in the middle of ordering a guardsman to perform a maneuver that contradicts standing medical guidance issued by the Ministry of Defense in April of this year. Reference document MOP/GS/24/07. I have a copy on the clipboard if you'd like to see it. The thing is, ma'am, soft knees, Color Sergeant. Microflexion. The muscle pump of the lower legs returns venous blood to the heart and prevents vasovagal collapse during prolonged static standing in high ambient temperatures. The current ambient temperature is 31 degrees Celsius. The forecast for Saturday is 33. The technique has been formally adopted by every Foot Guards regiment, including this one, with effect from the 1st of May. Whitlock's jaw had locked itself in a way his knees never quite did. Captain Routledge, with respect, I have stood on this square for 22 years. I have seen lads faint. I have seen lads stand. Actually, the difference is character, not knees. The difference, Color Sergeant, is physiology, and I'd prefer not to bury a guardsman this summer over a difference of opinion about which century we're in. A beat passed, then another. Whitlock's hand tightened on the pace stick. He was about to speak. The shape of the words was already forming in his throat. And then a third voice cut across the square, and every spine on the parade ground straightened by an inch without anyone meaning to. That'll do. Regimental Sergeant Major Frank Doyle hadn't been at the edge of the square a moment before. Now he was 51 years old. 30 years in the regiment, which silver at the temples, a face like weathered oak, the kind of presence that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. He had served 3 tours alongside a young corporal named Michael Ashby, who had died in 2008 in Helmand Province, and whose 2 sons had grown up in the long shadow of that fact. He walked across the gravel with his hands clasped behind his back. He stopped basically beside Captain Routledge. He looked at Whitlock for a long moment without speaking. Then he turned very slightly to Tom. Guardsman Ashby, sir, you may speak freely. Tom's eyes moved for the first time, not much, and just enough to find Doyle's face. The cracked watch ticked once against his wrist. Somewhere behind the railings, a small child asked her mother what was happening, and the mother shushed her without looking away. Tom drew honestly, 1 slow breath, in for 4, hold for 2, plus out for 6. A statue can't catch a falling brother, sir, he said. A soldier can. The parade square was, for perhaps 4 full seconds, the quietest place in central London. Honestly, Whitlock's mouth opened, it closed again. Something moved behind his eyes that he didn't let onto his face. Doyle didn't turn to look at him. He kept his eyes on Tom for a moment longer. Then he nodded just once and stepped back. Carry on, Color Sergeant, Doyle said. Rehearsal as scheduled. Medical officer present on the square throughout. Plus, soft knee protocol, I guess, in effect? He turned and walked away without waiting for an answer. Captain Routledge gave Whitlock a small, polite, immovable smile and walked to the shaded position near the eastern wall, where she would remain for the next 90 minutes. Whitlock stood for a moment on the gravel, alone in the center of 240 watching men, and then he barked the next command in a voice that was almost, but not quite the same as before. The rehearsal began. The first half hour passed in the heavy, ordered way that ceremonial drill always passes. Slow march, halt, present arms, plus slope arms. The slow building of muscle ache that every guardsman knows. The trickle of sweat down the spine. The itch you can't scratch. The for what it's worth. Fly that lands on your nose and stays there. Tom's knees stayed soft. He felt the small, almost imperceptible flex of his calves every 20 seconds or so. He felt the watch tick. He counted his breaths. At 45 minutes, the sun cleared the corner of the barracks roof and hit the parade square directly. The temperature on the gravel jumped 4 degrees inside 10 minutes. At to be fair, 60 minutes Tom heard the first sound. A small grunt, 2 ranks ahead and to the right. Someone shifting his weight. Whitlock's voice cracked across the square. "Stand still, that man." The shifting stopped. At 78 minutes, Tom saw the sway, which it was 3 men over in the front rank. Private Callum Reeve, 19 years old, 6 months in the regiment. Whitlock's favorite, the kind of lad who polished his boots twice an evening and called the colour sergeant staff with the eagerness of a puppy. He had kind of locked his knees the moment the first command was called. He hadn't unlocked them since. The sway was small. The first sway always is. A gentle drift of the bearskin cap. No more than an inch, forward and then back. Most men in the formation wouldn't have seen it. Tom had been watching for it for 10 minutes. He had seen the color go out of Reeve's neck just above the collar. He had seen the small twitch of the fingers around the rifle stock that meant the boy was losing the feeling in his hands. Tom did the honestly maths in his head without meaning to. Reeve was 3 positions diagonally forward, roughly 11 feet away. Plus the gravel between them was clear. The rifle would fall first, then the body. If the rifle fell to Reeve's right, the stock would catch the side of his head on the way down. If it fell to his left, he had perhaps a 1 in 3 chance of his face hitting the gravel cleanly without a strike to the temple. The second sway came, plus larger. Reeve's right knee began to buckle. Tom moved, and he didn't think about it. He didn't weigh the consequences. He didn't consider the charge sheet that would follow breaking formation during a colonel's review rehearsal. He simply moved, the way a man moves when his brother is falling and he is 19 years old in a kitchen in Reading, and there's nothing he can do, except this time he was 22 and on a parade square, and he covered the 11 feet in 3 strides. He got his left arm under Reeve's collapsing right shoulder and his right hand against the back of Reeve's neck just as the bearskin cap began to tip forward. The rifle slipped from Reeve's hands. Tom let it fall. The stock hit the gravel beside his own boot with a flat, dead sound. The boy's, full weight came down onto Tom's left arm. Tom went with it. He didn't try to hold Reeve up. He guided him down. Knees first, then hip, then shoulder, then onto his side in the recovery position, the bearskin cap rolling free across the gravel. He cleared Reeve's collar with 2 fingers, which he checked his airway. He felt for the pulse at the side of the neck. It was there, fast and thready. But there, Captain Routledge, Tom said, not loudly. His voice didn't shake, heat syncope. I think pulse 120, breathing shallow. I need shade and water. Routledge was already moving. She crossed the square at a run that didn't look like a run. She was on her knees beside Reeve within 15 seconds. Tom was already loosening the boy's tunic at the collar and waist. Improve his legs, she said. Done, ma'am. She glanced sideways at him, just once, the smallest possible look. Then she went back to work. The platoon hadn't moved. 238 men still at attention. The drill hadn't been called off. Whitlock stood in the center of the square, pace stick still under his arm, watching. He hadn't given the order to break. He hadn't given any order at all. His, I think, face had gone the color of old paper. Beyond the railings, the small crowd had grown. Phones were out. The man in the cycling jersey had lowered his coffee. The woman with the children had pulled them close. Nobody was speaking. Reeve's eyes opened 30 seconds later. He looked at Tom, confused. Then at the sky, then at Tom again. Tommy, you're all right, mate. You went down. Stay where you're. My rifle, on the gravel. Don't worry about it. Reeve closed his eyes. Routledge, had a water bottle to his lips within another 20 seconds. 2 medics from the regimental aid post were crossing the square with a stretcher. Tom stood up slowly, which his left arm was shaking, the kind of fine tremor that comes after adrenaline and not during it. The gravel had taken a small piece out of his right palm, where he had caught his own weight on the way down. He didn't notice, which he looked up across the square. Colour Sergeant Reginald Whitlock was looking back at him. The look lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It contained in that short span the collapse of a thing Whitlock had believed for 22 years. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even shame, and it was the quiet, terrible recognition of a man who has just understood that he was, in the most important way, wrong, and that the cost of being wrong had been about 3 seconds and 11 feet away from being catastrophic. Whitlock's mouth moved, no sound came out. He looked down at the gravel, plus he looked up again. He turned to the platoon. "Rehearsals stood down," he said. His voice was rough. "Return to barracks. Medical officer's orders." He didn't look at Tom again. I mean, not then. The platoon broke, which the crowd at the railings exhaled all at once, the way a crowd does when a thing has nearly happened and hasn't. The medics lifted Reeve onto the stretcher and carried him toward the aid post. Captain Routledge walked beside them, one hand on the boy's wrist, counting. Tom stood alone on the gravel for a moment. He bent down. He picked up Reeve's rifle. He, for what it's worth, picked up the bearskin cap. He carried both off the square. The barracks locker room was cool and dim and smelled, as it always smelled, of boot polish and old wool, and the faint mineral tang of brass cleaner. Tom sat on the wooden bench in front of his locker for a long time without moving. He had to be fair. Taken off the tunic, and the undershirt beneath it was wet through. His hands were finally still. The door creaked. Lance Corporal Sunil Bhatt walked in carrying 2 enamel mugs of tea. He had basically been on the 3rd rank that morning. He had pretty much seen all of it. "Tactical tea," Sunil said, handing one mug down. "The regiment's actual secret weapon. Forget the rifles, we could conquer France with this." Tom took the mug. The tea well was the color of mahogany and strong enough to dissolve a spoon. "How's Reeve?" Sitting up, drinking water, plus asking where his rifle is. "He'll live, good." Sunil sat down beside him. He didn't say anything for a moment. He sipped his tea. "Which you broke formation, Tommy. I know. On a colonel's review rehearsal. I know. But that's just me, in front of the RSM. Sunil, I'm just saying, if they court-martial you, can I have your boots? You've got the good ones from the Aldershot lot." Tom almost smiled. It was the first thing close to a smile his face had done in several hours. He reached up, to his left wrist. He undid the leather strap. He held the watch in his palm for a moment, the cracked glass catching the dim light from the high window. It was still ticking, which it hadn't stopped, not through any of it. He, I guess, turned it over and looked at the back, where Daniel had scratched 2 small letters years ago with the point of a compass. DA, just the initials, just TBH enough, which he put the watch carefully on the shelf inside his locker, on top of the small folded photograph of his father in dress uniform that lived there. He closed the locker. He heard the footsteps in the corridor before he saw who they belonged to. Heavy, measured, unmistakable, Colour Sergeant Whitlock appeared in the doorway of the locker room. Sunil stood pretty much up very quickly. Colour Sergeant, Bhatt out, Sunil out. The door swung closed behind him, and Whitlock came 2 steps into the room. He stopped. He was holding the pace stick across the palms of both hands, horizontally, the way a man holds a thing he is about to give away. Tom stood up slowly from the bench. They looked at each other for a long moment. Neither spoke. Whitlock's mouth worked. He looked at the floor, which he looked back up. "You know your brother?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "Which Daniel Ashby, Horse Guards?" "2 TBH, Summers back. Yes, Colour Sergeant. I was on that parade." Tom said nothing. "I was the one who picked his rifle up off the gravel. One more thing, the room was very still. I didn't know he was your brother. Not until this morning. The RSM mentioned it before the rehearsal. I should have known. Plus, I should have looked at the name on the roster and worked it out, and I didn't." Tom's throat had gone tight. He kept his eyes on Whitlock's face. "I've been telling lads to lock their knees for 22 years, Ashby. I've buried 2 friends from this regiment. I never put the 2 things together. I should have. A wiser man would have." He stepped forward. He held the pace stick out across his palms.